right, welcome back to another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. And Ryan, it's you and I in the podcast room, but we have another guest, a returning guest. I think this may be his fourth time or fifth time. Glenn Longabaugh, our Regional Agronomist with Winfield. Glenn, are you on the phone?
I sure am.
All right.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey, Glenn, we want to thank you for, we just finished a whole series of grower meetings at Premier Ag and across the whole trade territory. Do you want to give us kind of a recap about some of the topics you covered and some of the things that are on growers' mind? And you can take your agronomist hat off and on as we talk about this, and just you also do some farming, and we appreciate that because we get a lot of insights off your farm. And just kind of give us an update on how things are and what's on your mind today.
Yeah, I think that would be my pleasure. So I guess I would say first that the meetings were very well attended. And I like to believe that's because I was a speaker, not because it's mandatory. It's mandatory they have PowerPoints, right?
Yeah, it was Glenn Longabaugh. That was
we're going to say that. Ryan, I heard you chuckling. Let's say that right now they were really interested in what I had to say.
I didn't actually didn't have time to make one of them, and I didn't know you were the one that was doing the speaking. I think that would have changed things.
Well, I do appreciate that. So we had several topics that we covered, right? We talked primarily about nitrogen management. We talked a little bit about some of the claims that are made around biological fixation and some of the new products in the market. And then at most of the locations, we actually finished talking about in-season management. And if I was going to recap the nitrogen management, I would say it really falls it was really about three things, right? First of all, nitrogen is a leaky system. And so, and that's if we make all of our decisions, keeping that in mind, that it's a crazy complex system, right? Just about the time you think, well, I know what the fate of this is going to be, right? If I put this much on, I'm good. Well, yeah, that's only if you account for leaching and denitrification and immobilization and all these other processes, right? But nitrogen is a leaky system, and so that really brings me to the second point, and that's that we should always hedge, right? When you're making a plan on nitrogen, it's okay not to try to put it all on one time, or to try to overshoot by 100 pounds. But you do have to sandbag some. You do have to hedge against losses and just against nature, right? Because that's unfortunately, that's the truth about nitrogen, right? Is it's just this leaky system, very complex. There wouldn't have been that many PhDs earned studying nitrogen if it wasn't a pretty complex topic. And then lastly, it's really about really protecting that investment, or at least limiting the exposure through timing and stabilizers. And I think that pretty much sums up what we talked about this last week. We did, I would say that we had a lot of interest in biological fixation, and probably because the marketing for some of these products like Prove-In has been just relentless, right? We went through the entire farm hearing about how these biological fixation products like Prove-In 40 are basically your first 40 pounds of nitrogen. And, you could have probably made that claim 2 years ago and no one would have contested it. But today, we've got data from retailers, we've got data from the University of Minnesota, we've got data out of Illinois, and we've got local data from Purdue University that really would suggest that that's probably not the case, right? And so I don't want to poo-poo. I don't want to kill these products off because they're novel. And there's potentially a future in these kinds of products. But I think that the marketing has got well ahead of the science. And unfortunately, they're probably making claims that can't really be backed. And if you look at the university data, it would suggest that I would just say this. Yeah, I would not be doing my job if I let a grower replace the first 40 pounds of nitrogen with a biological fixation product. That's what I would say.
Especially in an environment where nitrogen prices are hovering around that dollar a unit or more.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and by the way, that's why farmers would be vulnerable to it, right? I got a school, Sal, in 1985, and agriculture was kind of on its heels. And believe it or not, there were a lot of products there that were really aimed to exploit the fact that farmers were in trouble and that profitability was tough, right? And so there were folks even back then that were trying to sell biostimulants, biologicals, alternative fertilizers to replace pounds. And yet, you got to understand that agronomically, we don't grow crops in a closed system, right? It's not like a forest out here where, when a tree falls down, it just gets, it degrades and recycles all those nutrients. We are constantly, every time we pull a crop off that field, we are pulling mineral nutrition out of that piece of dirt.
I remember there back when the controlled release type nitrogens came out, and I don't remember how many pounds they touted, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. They were like, no, it's the efficiency of that many pounds. That's tricky. That they really have to read through that.
You really do. Yeah. Efficiency is not a dirty word, but if I can tell you my day job, I work for I work for a PhD out in Nebraska for a good while. His name's Randy Brown, and Dr. Brown is, he was an editor for the last edition of soil fertility and fertilizers, right? It's almost like the Bible for soil fertility, right? It was originally written by Nelson and Tisdale, and I can tell you that Randy Brown, if you ever talk about efficiency, you're going to get a dirty look, because that's typically that is a word that normally kind of makes agronomists and soil scientists, that kind of makes their hackles flare, because oftentimes that's where you're trying to replace a conventional fertilizer or some kind of mineral with something at a substantially lower rate, right? That's typically when you use the word efficiency. So, you could use it honestly in nitrogen and say, hey, the efficiency is better whenever you try to time nitrogen applications. But again,
you still use nitrogen.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's been corrupted. I'm just afraid it's been corrupted, I guess is the best way to put it.
That's the most polite and politically correct way to put it, I guess.
Well, you guys got after me about using colorful language.
And we pushed our fuel department to talk about electric vehicles once too. So we get it. We bait you. We bait you occasionally.
Yeah, that's true. Your listeners probably don't care, but I'll tell you one thing. When it comes to you two asking questions, I feel like I want to go back to school and get 2 more degrees, one in economics and the second in psychology. Right? that a lot of the questions you guys ask is really aimed around, well, how do growers feel? And I'm not sure I know how growers think. But I am a grower.
I was going to say you are one.
I am, but not everybody thinks the same, right? And not everybody learns the same. Not everybody thinks the same. So what other questions you guys have? We did do some training around in-season management, and pointed out that that's a great way to really. Let me start over. If you think about 2022, and I've said this before, because of input costs, it's going to be like playing poker and pushing your entire pile of chips into the center of the table before you ever have seen a card, right? And consequently, that leaves us a huge exposure for risk because we have so much invested in the crop, and yet growers can really maximize their dollar spend by pushing more of those treatments into the season itself, right? And so I'm not suggesting that you replace soil fertility with in-season management with nutritionals, but I'm saying do a good job on soil fertility, and then, oh, by the way, use competitive intelligence in season to manage those nutrients to the highest level with nutritionals, right?
Yeah.
It's not really the same thing. It's almost like getting 2 or 3 cards and saying, oh my gosh, I've got a great hand started. I think I'll bet a little bit more, right? That's really what it would be.
Well, one thing that strikes me is just how the variability in our territory of growers' experiences with different practices. And sometimes, you get stung and it's like, I'll never do that again. And then other growers that may have a good experience, maybe let's talk about like fungicides in soybeans. They have a good experience,
yeah.
And then they're sold on it. And I think one of the things that I heard clearly that you spoke about over the last week and a half was just managing this that vegetative stage of the soybeans. And I think that's one part that we miss a lot. And talk to us a little bit about just keeping the plant healthy from that vegetative stage and through the reproductive stages. And one of the things I'm thinking about is that you talked about kind of moving your applications and maybe moving one earlier and one later and considering 2 applications. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Just give your thoughts on that from an agronomy standpoint.
Wow, what a great segue. So I love the way you posed that, right? You started, we're segueing here, obviously, to high yield soybean management, right? And the place you started is the same place that most growers start, right? They start with fungicides, and yet I'm so glad you started there, because in reality, high yield soybeans don't start with fungicides. They start with picking the right variety and picking varieties that don't that don't have weaknesses to systemic disease, soil-borne diseases, because you can't fix that with a fungicide. It starts with seeding rate and using, and by the way, kind of reduce seeding rates and using seed treatments to actually ensure that when you reduce when we subvert the seeding rate, then it becomes critical that every one of those comes up, right? So it's also about the seed treatment. It's about soil fertility. It's about weed control, right? And then as we get into the season, then it's about in-season management. And there, I guess probably the takeaway this week, what I probably shared most with growers is that we are probably not managing deep enough into the season, right? If you think about the average grower, he plants the crop, he burns down, he plants the crop, he goes in with an early post-emerge with some extra residual. He gets, into June, and maybe he makes another application to get rid of weeds. And then we get into July, we get to R3, and he makes a fungicide and maybe an insecticide application. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to time that application so that one application will take care of the early season diseases and clean up septoria off the bottom of that plant so you don't lose all the pods off the bottom. And then, but not make it so early that you don't have protection into the heart of the reproduction stage, right? The end of July through August, which is really when the story of soybean yield is written. And one of the things that my high yield growers have done that has made a profound impact on their yields is really splitting those applications, right? Make that first application about the time the rows knit together. In other words, about the time your rows close is typically when you start building up a lot more moisture in the canopy. It takes a lot longer for that under canopy to dry out. And of course, that is the perfect environment for disease, right? Most diseases, for them to set up housekeeping, it's not like it's a spore is not like a seed that just germinates and immediately sticks its aprosorium into the leaf, right? Oftentimes it takes, 8, 10, even 12 hours of free moisture on the leaf for that process to take place. And so what we've done is we started moving growers from a single R3 application to maybe an R2 application about when the rows close, clean that plant up, use nutritionals to help feed that plant, and then postpone the R3 application into an R4, R4.5 application, because that's much closer and should provide protection, right? If we get 3 weeks out of a top shelf fungicide, maybe even a month, that should protect us right through grain fill, right? And remember that yield in soybeans, right, is really not developed much until we get into the heart of August, right? Oftentimes it's the latter part of August is when we go into the last half of August is when we go into R5, and that's really when soybeans are built. And you guys have seen this, right? We have probably focused entirely too much on early season with soybeans, and once we get down at R3, we abandon them, right? And they have the other half of their life to fend for themselves. And so our high yield soybean growers, how they've really pushed the mark is by managing deeper into the season, right? R3, you're really barely halfway through that growing season.
Go ahead, Ryan.
You had insecticides, both of those passes too, Glenn?
I do. Insecticides are very, very important, and I'm not going to talk about how excited stink bugs get me. But
we'll guide our listeners back to an earlier episode.
I let my wife hear that
one. So yeah, stink bugs are really a problem, and so we. And they're a problem because of the way they feed on plants, right? And they're also very hard to control because they're fairly hard shelled. They're not a coleoptera, but they have a hemolytra. It's a half membranous, half leathery wing. They have a large body, which means the sphericals that they breathe through have more surface area, which allows them to kind of filter out, if you will, insecticides. So using big rates of strong insecticides is important, right? So if you're using lambda-cyhalothrin, a Grizzly 2 or a Warrior, you probably need to be up at that 1.9 ounce rate. If you're using bifenthrin, right, you need to be in the upper end of that rate. I can tell you that I have personally been using imidacloprid in both of those applications, right? So I make 2 applications of insecticide and I put 2 insecticides. One would be, a contact like bifenthrin or lambda-cyhalothrin. All the Winfield brands would be Tundra and Grizzly 2. And then on top of that, we added Vise 4, which is imidacloprid, which is a systemic insecticide. And that gives us maybe a little additional control. It's not really labeled for stink bugs, but it does give us maybe a little extra control on the stink bugs, but it really helps us on some of the other insects that we combat in soybeans, right? Stink bugs are not the only insect. In fact, there are some that go completely undiagnosed. For example, Southern Indiana has a real problem with deck tease stem borers, and deck tease stem borers have been around a long time. It's basically the larvae of a longhorn beetle, and the longhorn beetle mother will lay eggs on the petioles. Those eggs will hatch, and they'll tunnel into the petiole and down into the stalk, into the culm of the soybean. And typically they feed on that pith, but they do disrupt some of the vascular system, right? And so they can have an impact on yield, just like bean leaf beetles, just like grasshoppers, just like green clover worms, just like cabbage louvers, right? I mean, there's a plethora of insects that are out there trying to hurt your soybean yields.
And when we get into high yield soybeans, or the push toward that 100 bushel mark that's our goal for high yield soybeans or greater, because if you have 100 bushels, it's in some parts of that field you've got 130 or more, in places, or 120s. But that's our goal, is to get rid of all those insects that are not beneficials, and to get in an area where we don't have many. Let's say that some of the imidacloprid products are short supply. Just a bifenthrin by itself would be a good. It'd be better than not, right? I mean, not having a.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. When it comes to insecticides, just, I don't want to say that integrated pest management is dead, but when integrated pest management was a new concept, insecticides were probably the same price they are now. And yet commodity prices of, the commodity price of soybeans, for example, was probably a fourth of what it is now. Right. And
the yields
and typically we were looking at, yields were significantly less. Absolutely. And so, I wouldn't discourage anybody, but I'm so glad you brought up supply, because supply seems to be like this dark cloud that hangs over us right now. And so because there's this uncertainty about supply, I kind of noticed that it's almost like growers are almost afraid to make a decision because, I may not be able to get that, right? Well, that's the surest way not to get it, is not to plan, right? And so if I was a grower, or if I was consulting growers on this particular topic, if we can't get imidacloprid, well, guess what? There are premixes out there like indigo that potentially you could get. But you know what? You can't get it if you don't go sit down with your account rep and make a plan and actually try to tie some up, right?
Yeah. And if we don't have A or B, C may not be that bad of an option. Even agronomically. So...
Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with indigo. Indigo is just a premix of lambda-cyhalothrin with thiamethoxam, which is another systemic insecticide. So I don't know if you want to hear me go off about making plans, but I've kind of caught myself up in this, right? It's amazing. We had a meeting this week, and one of the things I appreciate about Premier, I want to brag on some folks. We had a supply meeting this week also. And I got to tell you, it warms your soul to see the amount of work that Mark Canary and David Brim have put into, not just trying to find products, but really try to figure out ways to help mitigate these supply issues for their customers. You can tell they are fully and completely engaged. And when it comes to fertilizer, right, you had Scott Sharp and Jeff Jarrett, I don't want to say they looked like they were bewildered, but there's no other way to put it when you consider there is, a fair portion of the business that has not obligated on what they're going to do next year, right? To me, I'm sitting here thinking, nitrogen is short and nitrogen prices are high, but to not make a decision thinking, I'll just wait and see if nitrogen goes down and then maybe I can buy it cheaper. That's highly unlikely at this stage, right?
Yeah.
And so by just kicking the can down the road and not making a decision, you're kind of making a decision.
You made one, right?
And you're only that's right. And you're only going to make things worse, right? So I would say make a plan by making a decision and then sit down with your account rep and do some negotiating, but for the most, the primary thing you got to do is communicate what it is that you're going to do for this next year, so they can help mitigate the problems with supply this year. Right?
Yeah, I think one of the things they said was you don't have to buy it. Just tell us you need it.
Exactly.
You don't need to buy it today, but just let us know you need that 80 tons or that 100 tons. Just let us know it's coming.
Yeah.
And it changes
and then
every
the other
day.
thing I would tell. Oh no, go ahead.
It changes every day. That supply projections and it just does, and nothing is pointing to the fact that there's going to be a major crash in any of these markets. Not right now. You look at the markets and it's March almost $17 beans and March $7.60 corn and new crop is still substantial numbers. I doubt if there's any reason this goes south for a while. So.
That's right. You said a mouthful, Ryan. There is a ton of opportunity, and yet I kind of feel like most of our decisions are based on fear. Right? We're afraid to sell. We're afraid to sell new crop because what if we don't grow it, or what if it goes up more? Right? And yet. Going into this year at harvest, if somebody told you would have the opportunity to sell new crop beans for $14 and a half, you would have thought they were, you would have thought they were either crazy or stupid, right? And so, Yeah.
What's our politically correct word for
again,
stupid today?
Right. We've been trying to find politically correct words to interject in these podcasts. I don't know that we have one for that.
Earlier, I said goat. I said goat pastures, and Ryan pointed out that we call that marginal ground. We don't call it.
I don't know.
Goat.
Professionals call that marginal.
Well, this thing, I'm afraid this podcast has maybe slipped off the slope here. We're maybe on some of that marginal ground now. So the high ground, we've kind of gone.
Oh my
We've kind of got into the hillside.
Well played, Glenn.
Kind of got off into the hillside, but I think there's a takeaway here, right? It's make a plan by making a decision, consult with your account rep, and communicate what it is you're going to do, and then get your own house in order, right? I can tell you that I don't feel currently as a grower that I'm prepared to execute, right? I mean, once you've made a plan, man, you got to get. If you're going to execute, we are less than 11 months away. Right? Look at it this way. Less than 11 months ago, we had a big part of our soybean crop in my neighborhood planted 11 months ago or less.
Yep.
So, yeah. So, this, this date is approaching, and I would say, work on first things first, right? Probably not the time to start dismantling your corn head if your planter's not ready to go. I would say get your sprayer ready to go, get your planter ready to go, get your toolbar, etc. Right? The things that you're going to use first, try to get those things ready. If you have field work to do, I'd try to get those things prepared too. But as a grower, oftentimes we get caught up in things that maybe don't have to. It's about triage, right? It's about recognizing those things that are almost in peril and working on those things first. Kind of separating out what is really important and what's not. And there's nothing puts you in that mode like a nice, warm, sunny day, right?
Yep.
Because you can do more in 2 hours in the spring. You tell me if this isn't true. You can do more in 2 hours in the spring when it's 65 degrees and the sun's shining than you can do in 2 weeks in the shop in the wintertime.
That is true.
That's exactly right. And I think that's probably a good spot to wrap this one up on, Ryan. And that's a good thing is get your priorities, get your plan, prioritize, and get it done here before we get this crop in the ground.
Yeah.
So,
and communicate it with somebody, right?
And finish it out. Tell somebody about it. That's right. Ryan, you got anything else for Glenn?
I don't. Glenn, thank you very much. And that checklist that we need for spring, we should revisit that too, and look at a possible series coming in as we get closer. Because you're right, 70-degree days make people think it's time to go, and it's probably time to go.
Absolutely.
Glenn, thanks for joining us again. We always appreciate your insight. Well,
thank you, Ryan. Sal, it's been my pleasure. You guys make it a lot of fun.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
That concludes another episode of The High Ground powered by Premier Companies.